and Goodwin Education Center. This is one of the departments of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Southern New Jersey. And want to welcome all of you here. I think there were about 125 last time I looked. Our volunteers and professional staff work tirelessly throughout the year to teach the history and lessons of the Holocaust to students, teachers, and community members throughout the South Jersey area. Today, we're happy that you have joined us to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Since 1953, Yom HaShoah, which you're probably more familiar with, has been the Jewish community's day for internal reflection and is observed in the spring, usually April or early May. It began in Israel and provides an opportunity to honor the victims of the Holocaust along with their liberators and those who helped them survive, to recognize the achievements of the survivors and refugees who have given so much to society, as well as an opportunity to educate children, to unite in passing on the torch of remembrance. Yom HaShoah is usually commemorated by Jews in synagogues and at other Jewish community events, as we do each year in our community, and will again do this year on the evening of Thursday, April 8th. So be sure to mark your calendars for that night. In 2005, at the request of the State of Israel, a United Nations resolution established the 27th of January as International Holocaust Remembrance Day to mark the anniversary of the day that the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp was liberated in 1945. The UN urged every member nation to honor the memory of Holocaust victims and encourage the development of educational programs about Holocaust history in order to help prevent future acts of genocide. It rejected any denial that the Holocaust occurred and condemned all manifestations of religious intolerance, incitement, harassment, or violence against persons or communities based on ethnic origin or religious belief. It called on everyone, regardless of their religion or ethnicity, to remember the victims of the Holocaust and preserve the Holocaust sites that served as Nazi death camps, concentration camps, forced labor camps, and prisons, as well as establishing a UN program of outreach for Holocaust remembrance and education. Today, we're doing just that and using this anniversary for remembrance and education. It is our honor to welcome Roberta Grossman to speak to our community. Roberta wrote, produced, and directed the powerful film that hopefully most of you have seen, Who Will Write Our History? I hope all of you have had the opportunity to watch it this week via the link to the film you received with your registration confirmation. And for any of you who came in late, Helen had commented that the link will be there through tomorrow. Diane Bannon, one of our Rob Goodwin education facilitators, has graciously offered to interview Roberta about her film. Hopefully she'll ask all the questions that came to your mind as you watch the film. Just in case she misses anything though, please use the chat box to enter your questions, and she will try to allow some time at the end for Roberta to answer as many of these as we have time for. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Diane Bannon, whose conversation with Roberta Grossman will help us to learn so much more about the film, Who Will Write Our History? So Diane, it's all yours.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We're so grateful to have all of you here with us. It is my absolute honor to be here to have a dialogue with Roberta Grossman as we talk about her incredible film, the documentary with dramatic elements, Who Will Write Our History? Hopefully you have had the opportunity to watch it, as it details the first-hand experience of the Jewish population within the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto, taken from the writings of Oyneg Shabes, which was organized by Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum. So Roberta, as I was thinking about what to ask you, I thought about the common human thread that connects not only you and I, but with the group that is here with us tonight, and that is education. We are all educators, and it is such a strong responsibility for all of us to move this history forward. I am a Holocaust educator, and I could take this material and try and teach it over several weeks within a class. I can guarantee you that I would not reach the level of personal experience, the human experience that you get when you watch the film. So for me, this film is a gift that Roberta has given not only to this small group, but to the world. And for that, thank you, Roberta.
Thank you very much.
So first question is, how did this project end up in your hands?
Well, it didn't end up in my hands. I grabbed for it. I was at the time I was developing another film that takes place on a subject that takes place between the wars in Warsaw, Jewish Warsaw, and I read a review of Sam Cassow's book, Who Will Write Our History, and I got the book immediately, and I was maybe a page in when I basically had one of those stop the presses kind of moments when I realized that this was the most important little known or unknown story of the Holocaust, and that there was no better way that I could spend my time and my life energy than to tell the story. Sam Cassow did a fantastic job. His book, Who Will Write Our History, is a masterwork of history. My goal was basically to translate that for a popular audience, to make it accessible to millions of people all over the world. And that's what I set out to do.
And how significant was the sense of responsibility, not only to you, but to the cast and crew?
Yeah, well, so it took 8 years to make the film. It was released in 2018. I would say that for the 8 years I spent making it, that the sense of responsibility that I felt to do a good job in telling the story was pretty crushing. Because I recognize that, my films tend to be kind of expensive because of the way that I make them. And I didn't think that there was necessarily going to be another film in the near term about Emanuel Ringelblum and the Oyneg Shabes archive. So I felt like I had this one shot to get it right, and to tell the story in a way that would engage people deeply. And the cast and crew, I shot the dramatizations in Poland, with primarily non-Jewish Polish cast and crew, and they were very, very committed to doing everything that they could in their power and bringing their artistry and their commitment to telling the story. And they did a fantastic job.
And they did. I noticed that you included Samuel Cassell within the film, and how involved was he as you produced this?
Well, Sam is the world expert on the Oyneg Shabes archive, among other things, and he was very, very involved. I met with him when I first optioned his book, and then I just continued a dialogue with him throughout the years. He was with me when I was shooting most of the scholar interviews, and he was with me in Poland when I was shooting the dramatizations. To look over the set, to look over the historical accuracy of everything from buttons to, to wallpaper. Although we had scholars in Poland who worked with our production design team for a good 6 months before we got there, making sure all the details were correct. But he was also there to help the actors as a Yiddish coach for the actors. But basically, he was just there to help me make sure that we got things right, because there's not much value in a documentary or film that is a historical film if it's not accurate, or if it's not at least vetted heavily by scholars. At least that's the way that I feel.
And I agree. When the film first starts, and of course my radar is up because I know what to expect, the way you started the film with the storm in the background and the rain and the wind, and then followed by the train, and then followed by the background music of a single violin. To me, it's incredible how you opened this journey. Did a lot of thought go into that?
A lot of thought goes into, thank you for asking, a lot of thought goes into every frame. There are a million decisions represented in every frame. And I think that the hardest part for me in this film was the beginning. Because once you start, things kind of one follows after the other. But it was a complicated story. And, you know, because Sam's book is, you know, like this big, it's like the Bible or the Old and New Testament of the Bible in terms of its length and complexity. And a film doesn't have that kind of real estate. I like to think of a film as more like a haiku. There's very little room because things have to breathe and have to unfold. And in this case, we needed to understand the background of Polish Jewish history a bit, between the wars, before the war, to a little bit. You needed to understand the war itself. You needed to understand who our main characters were and their trajectories and their personal arcs. You needed to understand the creation and the running of the Oyneg Shabes, what happened to each of the individuals, what happened to the archive, what happened after the war. So there's a lot of material to go through. So yes, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it took 8 years to make. The hard part was not raising the money, although that was strenuous. The hard part was figuring out how to best tell the story. But once I decided to tell a story from Rachel Auerbach's point of view, which makes great sense to me now as it did then you were gonna, you know, then obviously to open with her coming back to Warsaw in her effort. She had been instrumental in encouraging the Jewish community to not rest until they found the cache, the first cache. She got some word. She was living in Lodz, in Łódź, because Warsaw was pretty much uninhabitable at the time. And she got some word that something had been found, and she came dashing back. And that seemed to me the logical place to start.
And was that your decision to start and end with her?
Well, as the writer, producer, and director of the film, I just argued with myself.
Sam writes in his book, and I'm going to quote, "This would have ended as a mass of anonymous victims without names, without identity, and without what little agency they may have possessed. We would only have memoirs of survivors."
Right.
What was the driving force for you specifically about getting this right? And how many iterations did it take to know that the format that you had was exactly what you wanted?
Well, you know, when we're editing, we do, you know, versions and save them and versions and save them. I think the film that was released was something like version 89. I wrote at least 20 or 30 drafts of the script. And, you know, there's a cliche in the film industry that films aren't finished, they're simply abandoned, because you can continue to fuss forever, but at some point you think, oh, well, this is the form. But in terms of Sam's quote, I think that's quite to the point. I mean, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet, who's one of the scholars in the film, says that without the Ringelblum archive, we would know nothing about the Warsaw Ghetto. We would only know what the Germans wanted us to know. We wouldn't know how people lived, how they communicated, how they helped one another, how they, you know, how they engaged in cultural activities, everything that they did to make life as bearable and as human as possible. And if you had the misfortune to have been in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then ahistorically, most people ended up in Treblinka and very few people survived there, but let's just say you ended up in Auschwitz and you survived Auschwitz to liberation. You probably wouldn't remember the day that a little girl was calling after her mother during the Great Deportation, "Mommy, Mommy." You probably wouldn't remember that detail. What you would remember is about, you know, how the horrible nature of moment after moment in Auschwitz, how you survived, who you lost. You probably wouldn't remember what the cost of bread was in 1940 versus 1941 in the ghetto. So these details, these eyewitness accounts are so powerful. And I think that that's the power of the film and the power of Sam's book, is that these are eyewitness accounts. Because up until now, most of what we've known about the Holocaust has come through survivor testimony, which is invaluable and hugely meaningful and powerful. But this is in the moment eyewitness accounts, and that's very, very rare.
Your blending of both documentary and dramatic elements, as well as photography done by the Nazi propaganda teams. How did that come to be in terms of the way that you blended it so beautifully?
Oh, that's just good luck. You know, it was an idea that worked. You know, with a documentary, there are some extra rules in terms of what's allowed, right? I mean, and the rules for documentary have been stricter than I agree with for a long time, and things are loosening up now. But I think in terms of blending archival material and dramatic material, the key is transparency. And those who have seen the film may have not noticed that 3 or 4 times during the film, I put my actors into archival footage using green screen. So for example, Rachel Auerbach, the actress playing Rachel Auerbach, is in a group of refugees who are trying to get inside a building to get services upon first arriving in the ghetto. And she starts out and she's in black and white like everyone else. And as she comes closer and closer to the camera, she alone comes into full color. And then as she enters the room, the building, we then cut into a recreation inside the building, a dramatization inside the building. So I'm trying to be transparent about that, so that if you're paying attention and want to go back and look at it, you can see I'm not trying to fool anybody about what's archival and what's contemporary reenactment or dramatization. I think that's the most important thing. Other than that, I think that, you know, we get to use whatever exists in order to tell the story in the best possible way. And for me, the writing of the Oyneg Shabes archive is so powerful that I felt like it needed visuals and scenes that could live up or match or enhance the power of the writing. And that's how I came to the dramatizations.
And did you have in your mind a global target audience?
Well, my main audience was Sam Kassow. I wanted him to be happy. There are no survivors of the archive alive, and I don't know that there are any of their descendants. Sadly, I didn't have contact with any that might be around. I wanted people who lived through the ghetto experience, survivors, to recognize what they saw and to feel that it was authentic. But yes, a global audience. I mean, of course, you know, the audiences are like, you know, ripples, right? The core audience, like I said, I wanted Sam to be happy. I wanted the scholars who participated in the film to feel gratified. And then Jewish audiences, survivors, and then Jewish audiences, and then, you know, global audiences. And we really have had that. We've had really a tremendous response all over the world from all kinds of audiences, including in 2018 on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We had an international, a global screening event where we had, I think, something like 500 screenings all over the world, with an anchor screening at UNESCO in Paris, and UNESCO headquarters in Paris. And we had satellite screenings with connection to Paris. It was quite a to-do. We've really tried to reach as wide of an audience as possible.
Was most of the filming done in Poland?
Most of the dramatic scenes were shot in Poland with Polish cast and crew. I shot the burying of the archive in an empty warehouse in Los Angeles. A lot of the interviews were shot in Israel, in the United States, I mean, different places in the United States and in Poland. But most of the dramatizations were shot in Łódź in Poland, and some in Warsaw.
I was especially impressed by the beginning of the film, where you used color photography and film to show Jewish life before the war. And that set the stage for knowing that for those who look at this and say their life was all about the Holocaust, to be able to look at people with hopes and dreams and lives and happiness and richness of family.
Yeah, that's remarkable footage. I mean, color footage existed for a long time before we're used to thinking of it as a color footage era. And there just happened to be footage that was shot in 36 or 37 in Warsaw. And there was a section on Jewish Warsaw. And yeah, I actually had thought about colorizing all of the archival footage, which has now been done in other documentary films. There was a film on World War I that was colorized. And but at the time, it's so 4 or 5 years ago, when I told Michael Berenbaum, who's a friend and a mentor to me, I told him that I was thinking of doing that. He said, "Well, that's great, but you better like leave town when the film comes out." And other people said, it's a sacrilege, you couldn't do that. So I listened to that and found my ways around other interesting ways of bringing the footage to life, because I think especially for young people, when you see black and white, you think, oh, that's 10,000 years ago. These aren't real people. When you see the footage in color, when you see people in color, you think, oh, they're just kind of just like me. So it makes it more relevant, relatable.
And I found that the contrast between the film and still photography that was done by the Nazi propaganda, in many of those, you used a background noise of a camera clicking. And the stark contrast between that and the reality was so apparent. And I don't think that, I know with my own students, I don't think they understand that this population was not asked to be filmed or photographed. It just happened.
Right. I mean, there's a fantastic film that you're probably aware of called A Film Unfinished, which is a documentary that came out a couple of years ago, and it was about the filming, the Nazi propaganda unit in the ghetto. And if you haven't seen it, or members of the audience haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And I sort of think of my film as the other side of the lens, right? I mean, the people being filmed expressing themselves and their thoughts versus being the objects. I mean, there was a propaganda unit that was an official propaganda unit that was in the ghetto to make a film showing how awful and dirty and foul the Jews were, and therefore worthy of extermination. But there were also, individual German photographers and soldiers on leave who came into the ghetto. And often, in some of them, you can see the difference in personality, who's behind the camera, because some of them are filled with compassion for the subjects, and you see the humanity very much of the subjects of their photography. And some of them are looking at the Jews like exotic animals in a zoo. So it is really all in the eye of the beholder. But in the film, I use the German footage and the Nazi footage and photographs. But when it's egregiously propagandistic, I say so. There's a lower third that says Nazi propaganda footage. When I think it's just verite footage, because it's the real people in the real time in the real streets, I just use it as a found footage or archival footage. You can see, for example, in this film, A Film Unfinished, I'm not sure if I showed this in Who Will Write Her History or not, but you see, for example, a Jewish woman carrying a bundle. She's terribly frightened, and she's stepping over a dead body in the street. And there were lots of dead bodies in the street. And you think, and the reason that the Germans were filming that is to show how callous the Jews were. They didn't even care about their own brethren, dead in the streets. But then you see take 2 and take 3, and she's being instructed to walk over this body. So it's very important to see the context of what you're looking at.
Absolutely. Another thing that was very noticeable throughout the film was lighting, shadowing and darkness. And on the other hand, I noticed that during the filming of the soup kitchens, that there was a brightness coming from outside where you could actually see in detail the faces and get more of the sense of what these people were going through. And then you followed that with the young man who is nothing but hunger and
Right.
just can't move beyond it. And it showed all sides of the deprivation in terms of who it was affecting, the old, the young, everybody in between, and how for some, they couldn't get past it.
I think it's called Chronicle of a Single Day. that piece of writing, and I only use a piece of it in the film. There's a remarkable piece of writing. Those who are interested should look it up, because he chronicles from the time he wakes up in the morning to the time he goes to sleep. And it's actually quite a satirical piece of writing, which I think is somewhat lost in the film, because he's arguing with his stomach. And the stomach is saying things like, "You stupid intellectual, you used to think it was so important, blah, 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 blah." You know, so it's a very charming and devastating piece of writing for those who are interested in looking it up.
Yes, and you portrayed it beautifully.
Thank you.
So knowing that there were only 3 individuals who knew where the archives were buried, you take us to after the war with Hirschwasser and the aerial photography that made it clear how they could find that particular building. And you show us the aftermath of the war and what it looked like, which for many people and many students is not clear. They don't understand. They say the war is over, everything's wonderful, and they close the page. So then you have the scene where Rachel Auerbach is walking through the rubble and ends up at that building waiting to see if it has been found. And as she walks up the stairs, Roberta, and that door is opened, I realized I wasn't breathing.
Right.
And the boxes are lined up with the rope tied around them. Was there a lot of collaboration about how that scene should go?
Everything in the film is based on the writing, either in the archive or Rachel Auerbach or Wasser's post-war writing. So I didn't make anything up. So, for example, Rachel Auerbach at the beginning of the film, she goes to see Auerbach, you know, sends somebody to find her. She goes to see him at the Jewish self-help, and there's dialogue between them. But that's based on her writing. I didn't make anything up. When Wasser is walking through the ghetto and he hears a violinist and he stops and listens to a violinist, that's from his ghetto diary, where he says, and I think the words are in the film, the ghetto is full with the sound of music, the stomach is empty, but the ears are full. And he goes on to talk about that particular violinist and the piece he played. So sometimes it's told with the words, and sometimes it's told with the words and images, both. In that case, those events were written about by Rachel Auerbach. I mean, the exact way that the room was, or the way the light was coming in, or the way the boxes were laid out at that moment. You know, she left some things to imagination, but I didn't really make anything up.
And I wouldn't believe that you had. When you went through the film, you had included scholars, Samuel being one, and others.
Right.
Was that for clarification for the viewer, or what was your strategy there?
Well, you know, I'm, I guess, a bit of an old-fashioned documentary filmmaker. I mean, it's kind of not groovy anymore to use talking heads, but man, oh man, what talking, what heads, right? I mean, these guys are so fascinating. They put things in context. They describe things in a way that you or I, well, maybe you, but I certainly wouldn't think of, and I didn't, you know, there's no narration in the film. So the scholars provide some of the historical interconnecting tissue between one time period and another, and one event or another, and they provide the context for what's going on. Because remember that, again, that the writing in the Oyneg Shabes is all eyewitness accounts. So they're writing without knowing how the story ends, or in some cases even, you know, what's going on farther than, you know, 10 blocks around them. So the scholars provide context, and I wanted the film to have the emotional pull and the engagement of a dramatic feature, and to have the gravitas of a documentary with scholars and documents and all that. So that it was a conscious effort to combine those things.
And I was grateful that you showed some of the contents of the archive so that the viewers could actually see what Ringelblum meant by bringing in everything that they could do to represent the what was going on, and then the richness of family life and diaries and every single detail. When I teach and when educators teach, our time is limited. We get to teach this for whatever time we're given. And at the end of our time in the classroom, that's it. But for you, this is something that moves forward forever, that there will always be this history, there will always be this visual, it can't be blurred by anything else, because it is the actuality of the life of those people.
The film is an archive, about an archive.
Very well put. I don't know how many questions we have, Helen. I could go on all night, Roberta, but
I'm going to stop you for a couple minutes. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. If anyone else has questions, now would be a good time to put them in. And Barney Kaplan, I'm going to let you go first. Aaron, can he unmute himself?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. No, I just made a comment that certainly the Ringelblum archives are very famous, but from a scholar's point of view, many people feel that the Diary of Chaim Kaplan is the best description of daily life in Warsaw Ghetto. This was a diary. Well, he started off as a personal diary, but on September 1st, 1939, he wrote that the events of that day will change the world, and he felt it was his obligation to record what was going on in Warsaw, and it was his intention to write a document that will be handed down through history. Now, of course, I have to mention that I have a personal bias in this regard, as this was my great uncle. The diary was smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto and kept buried at a farm outside the ghetto and brought to this country in the early 1960s, where it was translated by Abraham Koch of NYU and later at Tropsy College here in Philadelphia, and published as The Scroll of Agony in the early 60s, and then republished by the Indiana Press in the 1980s. He was, in fact, approached by Emanuel Ringelblum to participate in the Oyneg Shabes project, but he refused. He was kind of a very independently minded kind of guy, and he wanted to write in his own voice, and he didn't want to be subject to a committee. So he wrote almost every day in flawless Hebrew, I'm told. I do not read Hebrew, but I'm told that it is in perfect Hebrew. And I don't know if it would be amenable to a film, but it really does make for very dramatic reading. He was a scholar. He was a teacher. He went to yeshiva, but he also had a very strong secular background. And so if you have the time and the interest, I do recommend that it is available on Amazon. There are used copies. I have some copies. I know Robin Sue asked, David asked.
So I'm very familiar with that book, and thank you for mentioning it. And I don't think it's a matter of, either or, this one's better or that's better. The Kaplan's diary is the diary of one person, and it's an extraordinary record. And the Oyneg Shabes, Ringelblum's goal was to have as many voices as possible be preserved. And there were many people that Ringelblum went to, including Chaim Kaplan, and said, look, please give me your diary. It's invaluable. I mean, he was the biggest fan of diaries. He was encouraging everyone to write diaries. That's one of the reasons why people in the Oyneg Shabes wrote diaries. There were many really, really valuable diaries and collections that Ringelblum tried to get into the archive, and people didn't want to part with them. I mean, this is their diaries, their life, and they were then destroyed in the Great Deportation, and afterwards when Gestapo and teams of Jews who they had under their whip would go through the ghetto apartments and just kind of throwing everything away that they didn't think was valuable, and taking whatever they did think was valuable. So it is absolutely a miracle that Chaim Kaplan's diary was smuggled out and that it survived, and thank God for that. But there were many, many diaries that would have been invaluable. I'm not saying they would have been as valuable as that, but that were lost to the future because they were not in the archive.
Thank you. So the next question in the chat is about the third group of archives that were thought to be underneath the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. And they're asking, what is the basis for that speculation? And is there any movement to try and find them?
Well, it's not speculation. Horst Wasser, and one other gentleman were Emanuel Ringelblum's two executive secretaries. And really it was the three of them and Israel Lichtenstein, who was in charge of the physical collecting and ultimately bearing of the archive, who knew where the location of the caches were. They knew there were three. Horst Wasser, because he was in the ghetto, he knew, he was in the ghetto after the Great Deportation. Obviously, he survived that. He knew that the third cache was buried right before, may have been the eve of the ghetto uprising, because a lot of the members of the the surviving members of the Oyneg Shabes worked in that brush workshop that was right there, and they knew where it was. About 10 years ago, an Israeli team of archaeologists and historians got permission from the Chinese embassy in Warsaw, which is where that workshop was, to dig in their courtyard. And I think that they dug for about 6 weeks, the sophisticated material equipment that existed at the time. And they came upon some artifacts from the ghetto period, a spoon, this, that, but they didn't come upon more than a page or two of burnt writing. And Sam Cassow thinks there's a couple of possibilities for why that is. One is that the brush makers workshop was on a site of heavy fighting during the uprising, so the cache could have been destroyed then. Of course, the Germans obliterated the ghetto with bombing, could have been destroyed then. Or finally, and this is, I think, what Sam thinks is most likely happened, is that there was a great deal of treasure hunting among Poles at the end of the war and after the war, everywhere where Jews had been. And part of it was accurate, that those Jews who had valuables buried them in the hopes of surviving, coming back, unearthing them, and having the resources to start a new life. And also part of it was an anti-Semitic trope that all Jews had valuables and gold and were bearing, things. So everywhere that Jews had been, there was a kind of a digging and a treasure hunt. And so it's possible that somebody came upon the third cache and was quite disappointed that they came upon some vessels of some sort, and inside were papers and not valuables, and they could have destroyed it then. Some people think that some of the papers were actually taken by Horst Wasser to Israel and may form part of the collection at the Ghetto Fighters' House in Israel. But as far as we know, at least up to this point, that third cache hasn't been found, and there's not a great deal of hope that it will be. Because even if it were found, it's 70 years later underground. The first cache that was found, the 3 metal boxes, they weren't very well sealed. And even though they were found in 1946, there was a tremendous amount of water damage and mold. The milk cans that were found in 1950 were sealed much more effectively, and those documents were much better preserved. So who knows what the third cache, how it was. I don't know how it was, what the containers were.
Thank you. So the next question is, there are a number of educators in the audience today, and they want to know how it's possible for them to get access to your film to share with students.
Sure. So the film's educational distributor is Good Docs, the word good and the word docs, and they can make arrangements for educational licenses for educators. And there are 2 versions of the film. There's the feature-length version that I believe you have, and there's also an educational length version, which is classroom length. I think it's under 40 minutes. And I did it in collaboration with Facing History and ourselves. And Facing History can provide the study guide. and good docs can provide the film.
So the next question says, she feels sad that you have to say over and over again that you didn't make anything up in your film. And her sadness comes from the need to make this assertion in the face of Holocaust deniers. In a time when American citizens wearing t-shirts saying 6 million wasn't enough, what role do you feel your film plays in combating some of these deniers?
That's a very interesting point of view, because I wasn't saying that thinking about Holocaust denial. I was thinking about that just in terms of the authenticity of the film as a historical document. But you know, deniers are going to deny, and I'm not sure we could put a film like this out, or all the survivors' films and testimonies and books, and they still deny. So I don't know. Doesn't mean we should stop telling the story and stop telling the truth. And certainly, hopefully, the truth ultimately wins out. But that's not why I said that. But that's a very interesting perspective.
The next question says, would you comment on the involvement of some of the Jewish people in the ghetto who arrested their neighbors and put them on the transport to the concentration camps? Were they forced to do that?
It depends upon what you mean by forced. I try not to judge people in these extreme circumstances, and I can't imagine a more extreme circumstance than being in the Warsaw Ghetto. If my kids were starving and I was told that I would get food for them and we wouldn't be deported to our deaths, would I do that? I don't know. I'd like to think not, but I don't want to say for certain because I'm not in that circumstance. I think that the film and the entire enterprise of the archive and the writing in the archive is in large part about ethical choices, day to day, moment by moment. And I'd like to think I'd be super brave and wouldn't do that, but I don't really know. And the archive, the writing of the archive is just filled with just total hatred for the Jewish police. Yes, of course, there were Jewish police. They weren't forced. They were volunteers. They enlisted. But I don't know if you can be a volunteer in that circumstance. But they hated the Judenrat. They hated the Jewish police. There's no love lost in the writing of the Oyneg Shabes on the Jewish police. And you could see that in the film.
The next question says, can you speak about the reaction of the Polish government when you first set out to film in that country?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, because the government changed, right? I mean, when I first, I applied and received funds from the Polish government, from the Polish Film Institute for the film. And then the government changed and all the ministers, culture ministers changed, and we would have never gotten that funding. It was interesting. We showed pretty much unfinished version of the film in Warsaw on the eve of the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. What year was that? Anyway, it was before the film was officially released. And there were 500 people in the beautiful theater at the Poland Museum in Warsaw. A lot of Polish dignitaries were there. And I was just hoping that we would be arrested for breaking the law against implicating the Poles in anything having to do with the Holocaust, but because I thought that'd be terrific publicity, but that didn't happen.
Were they afraid of the publicity?
No, I think that the people who were there were self-selecting.
Okay. As a reminder, for those of you who may not have been on at the very beginning, the film is available through the link that we originally sent out, and Aaron will put it in the chat box again until tomorrow evening. Diane, I'm going to let you go with one more question while other people are putting questions in the chat box.
Okay, so I'll end by telling all of you, because I'm sure Roberta wouldn't, that in 2018 you received the Washington Jewish Film Festival Annual Visionary Award. I personally can't think of a better description, not only of you, but of your work.
Thank you.
Did you have any fear going through this process?
Fear. Fear of what?
Fear of getting it right.
Yes, that was my fear. I was terrified. I mean, it was a almost impossible task to tell such a complicated story in the amount of time, and that's possible for a film to hold an audience's attention. There's so many historical details, what to leave in, what to leave out. The choice of doing the dramatizations kept me up at night for many years. I was just terrified the whole time. And is it Barney who is the one who talked about Chaim Kaplan?
Yes.
Yes.
I can't do it while we're talking, but if you email me through the organizers of the event, I'd be happy to share a photograph of myself on the beach that a friend of mine took about 10 years ago with my light beach reading, which was The Scroll of Agony. And my friends love that photograph because it's like, oh my God, what a fun gal. And I'm happy to share that with you.
So Aaron just put the link in the chat box for anyone who has not had the opportunity to see the film or finish the film. The next question says, Roberta, if we were in person, you'd be on the receiving end of many heartfelt hugs.
No, that'd be
Despite
nice.
your failure to get arrested in Poland, you are a brave, brave person.
Oh, thank you.
So she's sending you a virtual hug.
I always welcome hugs when I show my films. They're the best part of the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Is that the end of the questions that you have, Helen?
So far, right now. If anyone else has a question, please put them in the chat box. Do you have another one?
I do not.
Oh my goodness.
Okay,
so here we go, Roberta. I'm going to ask you, we've talked about so many things tonight, and tell us what we didn't ask you. What should we have been thinking about as we watch the movie?
How do I stay so young?
Do you want to tell us, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in all of this?
I studied history. I started reading about the Holocaust when I was in junior high. I've always been very fascinated by Jewish history. I was a member of Hashomer Hatzair when I was in high school. I studied history in college. I had no idea what I was going to do. And I thought about going to graduate school in history, but I got the film bug and realized what I still believe very strongly, that film is the very best, very, very best, far and away best way to preserve and convey historical stories.
And how long have you been doing this? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, well, that's very open-ended.
Okay, you can limit it.
Well, let's see. I've been doing it since I graduated from college, which I have no idea when that was. I think it was 82 or 83. And I've made about 50 hours at this point of film and television documentaries, mostly on historical subjects. And right now I'm developing a film about Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I'm also developing, about to launch officially in March, a film fund for Jewish films, Jewish themed films. And I'm working, the great honor of working with the Claims Conference, making a short film with them on the history of the Luxembourg agreements and reparations from Germany for survivors.
You said when you were talking and Diane was questioning you that there were no survivors left from the who had been part of these archives. Were there any Warsaw Ghetto survivors that you had the opportunity to talk to who were still alive?
Yeah, I didn't talk to survivors in the making of the film because I was making the film about the archive and about based on the writing. But since that time, in some screenings that I've done, I've had the opportunity and the honor to have some survivors of the ghetto with me and doing Q&A and that kind of thing.
And were they aware of what was going on? Were they aware that these...
The archive? No, it was very,
yes.
very secret. I mean, the whole point was that the archive was the ultimate jewel, right? And they didn't want the Nazis to find it and destroy it. So there was this tension between how many people do we tell, because especially as time went on and they became less and less confident that people were going to survive. So there was a tension between telling enough people about the archive and where it was, and not telling, and the tension between that and telling very few people, so that if somebody was captured and tortured by the Gestapo, they wouldn't give away the location of the archive. So no, people were not aware of it. As a matter of fact, Rachel Auerbach, who is the narrator of my film, was a member of the Oyneg Shabes. She was interviewed by a woman who came to her soup kitchen to interview her, and she was there to interview her on behalf of the Oyneg Shabes archive about the role of women in the ghetto, but neither of them knew that the other was working with the archive. So it was a very closely held secret.
So we're getting a couple more questions in the chat box, and the next one, oops, I lost it, says, if you were speaking to high school students and one of them asked you why they needed to learn about this subject in your film, what would your answer to them be?
I would say that it's a fundamental part of being a human being to know about our past. And it's very, very important to be aware of the dangers of intolerance and looking at other people as other and less than human. And it can very easily slip into some dangerous stuff. And that the people who created the Oyneg Shabes and people who lived through that terrible period wanted very, very badly to be remembered. So just do me a favor and remember them.
So along the same lines of talking to high school students, the next question says, most of the people in tonight's audience are over 50 years old. Are you getting audiences of younger viewers between 15 and 35, for example?
Well, my job is to make the film and to do my best to get it out into the world and promote it. But I certainly am not standing at any theaters or at a turnstile at Amazon Prime preventing younger people from watching the film. We did have tremendous response from young people who saw the film, and hundreds of, I hope to think tens of thousands of kids have seen it in their schools. In Poland, a group called the Forum for Dialogue has been using the film. So, and I think sadly the film is evergreen because the end of the story isn't going to change. So hopefully a lot more young people will see it going forward.
So they are using the film in Poland to teach students. And did you initiate that to the Polish?
I reached out to Forum for Dialogue, but their whole program has been up and running for many, many years, and they're fantastic. They go into Polish communities that used to have, but no longer have a Jewish community, a significant portion of Jews in their population, and they help high school students. They basically set them loose in the community to find out about what was the Jewish community in their town and what happened to them. And then they come back and report to their peers. They're fantastic. It's a fantastic program. And yeah, they've been working with the film.
And one person asked, did you visit the Ghetto Fighters Museum in Israel before you did your filming?
Yeah, I've been to the Ghetto Fighters Museum many times, and I did a seminar for teachers there after the film was done, and I worked with them in their archival. Their archive is incredible, and I worked with their archivists looking for materials for the film.
Thank you. Well, I think that you have answered everyone's questions. The chat box is empty, and we would like to thank you very much for joining us tonight. The film was really powerful, and we loved talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And again, the film link will be active until tomorrow evening. And any teachers who are in the audience who did not get the information about getting access, I have that contact information. I'd be happy to share it with you. So thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight. And oops, Roberta, I lost you. There you are. Thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice
Thank
night.
you.